Every single time where I made an exponential growth in my income, in my business, it was rarely strategic. And what I want to do today is to help you create the same jumps, to help you make more money in your business. And the way we're going to do that today is by mapping your emotional signature. You're going to walk away with this video with more awareness over what is actually sabotaging your results. And we're going to go a little bit deep into it. You're going to enjoy this very much. And you're going to get the clarity on what you need to do to create the next jump that you want to create in your business. All right? I'm going to look here at my screen because I'm taking some notes and I don't want to forget anything. So this is not going to be cut. This is not going to be edited. We're going to keep it raw. All right. The first thing that I want to go into with you is that your emotional signature in your life is going to dictate your results. It will. And it's going to dictate how much money you can make. And it's going to dictate how fulfilled you are. And it's going to dictate a lot of areas in your life. And you're listening to this, you're like, what the fuck are emotional signatures? Let us go into it. Your emotional signature is essentially the spectrum of emotional states that you experience. There's upper limits and lower limits to it. Your emotional signature is the zone of reality, the interpretation of reality. There's a spectrum of interpretation, right? Think of reality as an infinite playing field. Your mind needs to interpret reality in a particular way, and it's impossible for it to interpret the infinite, otherwise you'd be enlightened. So it needs to interpret a finite segment of reality. Now, how do you decide which finite segment of reality you interpret? So that that interpretation ends up being projected onto reality that creates your life experience. That comes through conditioning, through your childhood. Some people say it's generational as well. And so it's kind of like you're programmed to interpret a particular segment, and within this particular segment, the content of existence is packaged. The emotions you experience, the income you make, the relationships you attract, the life that you lead, all are packaged into this emotional signature, right? On a daily basis, your emotional state dictates your daily experience. On a yearly basis, monthly basis, for some people that are unaware, throughout their lifetime, they remain in a single emotional signature, and that dictates the reality, right? So, you listen to this, you're like, okay, that makes sense. What do I do with it? The first thing that we need to do here is recognize or map out or become aware of what your particular emotional signature is. Every single human being has a different emotional signature. A lot of attempts of visualization and mindset work and all of the law of attraction stuff and the identity shifting stuff, what it's essentially attempting to do is somehow rewire the nervous system to shift the emotional signature, right? The problem with it is that sometimes the emotional signature is based in, allows abundance, but there are certain surface level things that are holding you back. So doing identity shifting can actually propel you. Other times, you have deeply embedded beliefs that require deeper psychological work than you just sweeping shit under the rug and visualizing new identity. Sometimes that works, sometimes that's not the case, right? So the first thing we need to do here, if you want to actually succeed at scaling your business, at stopping the self-sabotage, and before I get into that, I want to really quickly give you an example of this. When I scaled my business from $10,000 a month, where I was stuck doing 10K a month for about a year, and within 30 days, I end up making $62,000, and then I maintained that for a couple months, there was nothing strategic that changed in my approach to the business. In fact, for the first time in my life, I did not have a coaching mentor. I did not have a business mentor. I did not have someone telling me what to do. I did not go to someone else for permission or authority, and I did not learn anything new. My strategy, my content volume, my offer, none of it changed. There was one thing that changed during that time that 6x'd my revenue, which was my emotional signature. That is why I believe in this stuff so much. It's not because I, watched some videos and I just talk about psychology. No, I took all this stuff, I implemented it into my own business, and I saw how it works. So, the first thing that we need to do is map out your emotional signature. And the way you're going to do that is through a couple of steps. And mapping it out, the more awareness you develop, the more accurate of a map you're going to get. So if you have heightened levels of awareness, this is going to come to you more easily. If you don't, you might actually need to track stuff on pen and paper or in a sheet so that you actually see the map clearly. So the first thing that I want you to track, which can sound easy, but in the moment it's actually very difficult, is tracking your emotional states daily, right? Essentially what we're tracking is the fluctuations between different emotional states. Now this requires emotional intelligence for you to be able to label your emotional state in the first place. You need to be emotionally intelligent and capable of detaching, at least momentarily, from that emotional state so that you can look at it and label it. You can be anger, it can be fear, it can be doubt, it can be defeat. The more nuanced you can get in the identification of your emotional state throughout that week and how it fluctuates throughout the day as well, and you just, you put like 5 p.m., I'm experiencing this emotional state. This time I'm experiencing this emotional state. This time I'm experiencing this emotional state. Throughout the week. And then we look at that at the end of the week and see all the different emotional states that you experienced throughout that week and how long each lasted. We'll start developing a very, very initial map of the emotional signature, right? This is extremely important because that is going to give us insight into your emotional experience, which is also an insight into your neurochemistry, which is also an insight into your emotional volatility and turbulence, which is also an insight to your emotional capacity. So this is extremely, extremely important. Even though it seems simple, it's actually extremely important. The next thing that we want to do is we want to identify the triggers of those emotional states coming to existence. What is being triggered in your system? How are we interpreting reality in a particular way that is creating the experience? That's a little bit of a layer deeper. Initially, you just want to look at like, okay, if I look at a red wall, I feel this way. If I hear this thing from this person, I feel this way. If you're capable of tracking triggers as well, of like, okay, me opening up my phone and seeing a notification from my business, I get a dopamine spike. If the day ends and I still haven't made any income, I feel a dip. I feel low. I feel sad. I feel guilty. If I speak to this client, I feel drained. If I speak to that client, I feel energetic. If I talk about this, I feel this way. If I interact with my team member in this way, I feel that way. So at that point is like, if this happens, then this emotional state comes to existence. If this trigger happens, then this emotional state comes to existence. And so you kind of want to observe the emotional state while observing the trigger. That is extremely important. And so for some people, that's going to come very easy, especially if you've been meditating, if you've been doing some internal work. The awareness is going to come to you easily because there's some sort of detachment from the emotion or the ability to perceive it from a third-person perspective. If not, and you're very involved in your emotion, you might get lost in it. And that is fine. You can look at, once you're regulated again, you can look at it after the fact and be like, what did I experience? What do I think the trigger was? It's completely fine. The third step we want to do, and this is a little bit difficult, it's actually going to require you to sit down and really take a deep look into your consciousness, is uncovering the storylines behind the triggers. What do you tell yourself when that trigger hits? What conclusion does your mind arrive to? For example, under stress, when I'm triggered, when let's say I reach a certain threshold in stress, I get overwhelmed. I feel very overwhelmed. This overwhelm makes me lose sense of myself for a little bit and I start feeling defeated. When I feel defeated, I feel like a lone warrior. I feel like I'm facing a force too great to defeat. And so I experience a little bit of nihilism and hopelessness. This hopelessness clouds my self-perception and I no longer perceive myself as a skilled entrepreneur, but rather somebody out of control. There is layers of victimization there. And when I recognize that, I realize that, oh, I need to be stronger. There's an entire packaging of information that came to be due to the trigger bringing that up, right? I'm not going to go too deep here, because once we identify the storyline, we want to look at the formative experiences that bring rise to those storylines, and that is extremely important as well. But there's only so much we can do. But that goes into like the solution territory. Right now, we're only focusing on the mapping of the emotional signature, because that's going to give you a lot of clarity. You're going to be like, oh, it makes sense why I'm making this amount of money, right? And then the last thing that I want you to do is correlate your emotional experience, also your biological experience, to your income fluctuations. I want you to track how your income and business results move in parallel with your emotional states. Sometimes there is correlation, and sometimes there's causation, right? Correlation is when they're impacting each other, or actually just correlated. So it's not actually correlation. There's sometimes the income impacts your emotional state, sometimes the emotional state impacts the income, right? A lot of the times those are going to get really obvious at the lower limits and upper limits of the spectrum of your emotional signature. At the lower limit, you're going to kind of get into survival mode, and you're going to want to fight your way back to homeostasis, to regulation. And at the upper limit, you're going to slack off and you're going to sabotage. And sometimes in very, very, very unconscious ways. For me, it was never like blatant self-sabotage where I would like drink myself and get drunk, or like go do something insane that ruins my income. It was more so the ferocity that I approached my business with changed, and the interpretation of data in my business was different. Unconsciously, I would no longer be able to spot as much opportunity as I would be able to spot had I been in survival mode, right? Because my mind is unconsciously designed to keep me within that segment of reality, right? I want you to notice your income ceilings, where your nervous system deems itself safe and it stops pushing. And I want you to also track the self-sabotaging patterns that arise when it is at that stage. And I want you to notice your income floors, where the pain signal kicks you back into problem-solving mode, right? For a lot of people, that can, manifest itself in different ways. But get aware of it. This is extremely, extremely, extremely important. Now, once you do all of those 4 steps, your emotional signature starts to emerge as a clear picture. You start being able to track things. The cool thing is we're looking at it in business context, but you'll be able to extrapolate it into other areas of your life, like your relationships and your health and your spiritual growth as well. This kind of like, it's a core filter of reality in general. We're just contextualizing it to business at the moment, but it's going to impact you in many different areas. So the more deeply you engage in this process over a week, all it takes is a week. And what I'm going to do next is create a sheet or a tool for you to actually be able to map your emotional signature more clearly with more instructions. We're building this as we go, by the way, because it's extremely fun. You're going to be able to get very, very clear on the emotional signature. Now, here's the good news. For some people, it might be the bad news. The awareness itself is the hardest part, and it's the first step. See, some people might look at this and be like, yeah, I can do that. For me, because I did years of meditation, I can sit down and I can really go deep and track patterns and become aware of all the different perspectives at play that give rise to a certain package of reality, a certain bit of reality. But for some people, it might be a lot more difficult. And so you need facilitation. You need somebody to sit there with you and guide you through the process, to help you go deeper, to hold space for your awareness to come through, right? But once you see the pattern, you understand why your reality is the way it is. You kind of start spotting it, and the awareness itself will allow you to consciously intervene into those unconscious patterns. And even if you don't go any further from here, you'll still be able to have some sort of control on what you do in those moments. You'll be like, oh shit, I'm approaching the upper limit of my income. I'm probably going to start acting this way. I'm going to change some things in my environment and limit the triggers so that I don't do it again. And that can help. And that is what most people in the high performance world do. They control the external, right? So that it has an impact on the internal. What I like to do is do that while in tandem doing the internal work, so that the internal also impacts the external, and you're not owned by the trigger. You heal the triggers and you expand your emotional signature. Now, what you're going to do about it is going to depend on what your map reveals. And to me, at this stage in developing this modality, there are two paths that you can take. The first one is surface level, habits, routines, environmental changes, creating a vacuum. Let's say you're in a season of your life where you want to really scale the business in a particular way, you would create a vacuum environment, which means you're eliminating any sort of trigger to your consciousness, and you can kind of, at least for a short period of time, control the state you're in. But that requires constant input and consumption of the right information and the right, basically inducing emotional states at will. The other thing you want to do is changes in your lifestyle that reduce stressors and stabilizes your baseline state. And this, for certain people at certain stages, it works. Sometimes we need to, treat some things instead of heal them. We need to regulate, go back to a base state, create more clarity in the landscape, and then we can get onto path 2. Some other issues might require you to go on a deep level. For me, the transformation happened on a deeper level. Sometimes the patterns that you experience give rise to the dysfunction. So let's say sometimes there's a certain dysfunction or self-sabotage that you can fix with environmental changes, but other times the patterns beneath the dysfunction and the self-sabotage are going to keep generating the self-sabotage, so we need to heal them. So the surface changes will not hold. That's why no matter how much you attempt to change externally, it's not going to work. So this is where shadow work and certain psychological modalities and certain ways of dealing with things on a deeper level will come into play, where developing your awareness to a state, to a certain level, comes into play. You trace the pattern back to the original conclusion and you put a different spin on it, right? This is where you heal the core seed of a particular pattern that is holding that emotional signature by a rope. And the moment it lets go, it allows the expansion of the emotional signature or the change of the emotional signature altogether. The dysfunctional solutions that you come up with, the self-sabotage, fall away naturally once the root conclusion changes. And the path depends on what your map reveals, depends on your current stage of ego development, it depends on your current level of awareness. And we want to work with that so that we create the transformation. Now, this is the work. This is what I call the integral path. This is what I enjoy the most, because a change at the core is going to impact every single area of your life, and there is nothing as potent as this work when you do it properly, when you're not swimming on the surface, when you actually go deep into the ocean. So what I want you to do this week is to start mapping. Just 2 weeks of honest observation, doing the steps that I told you about, will show you more about yourself than years of working on your strategy and grinding your wheels and wondering why you can't crack through the income ceiling and being sold one business coach after one business coach, after a course, after a mentor. Doing this work is going to drastically transform your life in ways you've never thought are possible. Doing this work is what's going to 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x, 6x your business revenue. All right? If you do this properly, you are going to see results. Just the mapping alone, it's going to give you a lot of insight. All right? This is essentially a snippet of the work that I do with founders, with business owners, with personal brands, with coaches. This is part of the work. We actually do a lot more. We profile personalities, we align the business as well. But the emotional signature part is very, very deep, and we typically do the mapping process together so that you get an accurate look, and then we start working on, rewiring it. So here's what I want you to do if that's something you want. Once you come up with a map, send it over to me, and I'll help you come up with the path to rewiring it, okay? I really hope you enjoyed this video. This is the first video in a series of a lot of videos involving this deeper kind of work. And yeah, I shall see you